Hello, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be learning about arrays in Java. But first, let's just look at a couple of variables. So as you can see, I made 5 integer variables, which is just storing the ages of 5 people. Now, what if I want to store the ages of 100 more people or 1,000 more people? I can't just keep making more variables to store their ages, right? And at a point, it even gets harder to make up new variable names if your program is extremely large, or in this case, have a lot of people whose ages need to be stored as variables. Now, the fix for all of these issues is using an array. To understand exactly how that works, let's try to look at these variables in a more visual way. So as you can see, I added these 5 variables as little boxes, basically representing the memory location. And each of these variables is storing the age of that particular person. And what I told you is you just can't keep creating variables. It doesn't make sense, and it's also very inefficient. Now, what we can do, however, is transform this data. What I'm basically doing with an array is taking values of multiple data types and just storing it in one large box or one large memory location, and that would look something like this. So as you can see, I've stored all my values in just one large box, and this box is what we call a contiguous memory location. It doesn't mean that I'm storing all of my 5 values in the same memory location. It just means that my 5 memory locations are placed beside each other. Now compare this to my previous situation where I had 5 random variables. If you look at this, all of my 5 memory locations are randomly distributed. But if you store them as an array, they're stored as what's known as a contiguous memory location. Basically, they're just stored beside one another. And instead of giving each of my values a variable name, I can give my whole array a single variable name. In this case, age. Right, so now that we've understood what exactly arrays are, let's try to understand something known as an index or subscript. So the whole point of an array is to allow us to store multiple values of the same data type in one variable. But how do I access a particular value in this one variable? In this case, I have 5 values: 25, 14, 60, 12, and 3. How do I access a particular value? I don't know what these values are. As a user, I want to access the third value, but I don't know that the third value is 60. This is where we use something known as an index or a subscript. Basically, what Java does is it gives a position number for each of these values. Using your array name and that position number, I can access that particular value. And then those position numbers would look something like this. So these position numbers is what we call the subscript or the index for this array. Now you notice a very important thing. The position numbers don't start at 1. Intuitively, you always start counting from 1, so you would expect even this would start from 1. But just remember, it starts from 0. So that means that I have 5 values over here, but my 5th value has the position number of 4. Right. So understanding a little bit about how this index or subscript works, if you look at them, you see that your first value has an index of 0 or a position of 0. Your third box or your third value has a position or an index of 2. From now on, I just keep calling it an index number or a subscript. My fourth value has an index of 3. And you notice that this is really important. If I just mention my array name as age and mention a particular index, I can get a particular value. For example, age 0 should give me 25 because that's the value in that particular box. So you notice that these index numbers are basically like variable names, but they're provided by the Java programming language, and you don't have to set these variable names. So if I want to access 3 over here, we see that 3 has an index of 4. So age at 4 should give us 3. It's basically the same as variables. It could get a little more confusing because I'm using numbers for these positions instead of regular variable names. So now we're going to use these 5 values, and we're just going to make one array that can store all of these 5 values, just like we saw before. Now there are actually 2 ways to make an array. The second method is really easy, but practically we don't use it as much. So the first method is quite simple. We first mention the data type of the values. Now remember that all values of your array should be of the same data type. If it's an int, I need to mention int over here. After this, you add the square brackets, and then you add the name of your array. Remember, the name is how you access your array. In this case, my name would be age. Now after your name, you just add equals to, and you would just use what's called the new keyword, which you might have used in object-oriented programming. And you just continue this with the data type again, and these square brackets. So this is really simple to understand. You obviously need the name of your array to access the array. You need the data type to allocate the certain memory, and these square brackets just show that it's basically a box that stores multiple values. Now another important thing is I can put the square bracket over here, or I could also put it after the name. Both things are correct. Okay, so this is the first syntax, and we're just going to implement this in our program. So in this case, I'm making an array of the int data type. So I'll just mention int over here, and then I can add my square brackets over here, and after that we'll add the name for our array. In this case, it's age, just like we saw before, equals to new int and then square brackets. Now another important thing is you can't leave these square brackets empty. Here you need to mention the length of your array. The length of our array is the number of elements in our array. Now I am emphasizing on this point because we did see that there is a difference between the number of elements and the index number. If you look at this array again, you can see I have 5 elements, but my last index is 4. So when you put in the length, don't put in 4. Make sure that you put in the number of elements. You can just start counting normally. You have 5 elements, so the length of your array over here is 5. Now this gives us another important relationship. The length of our array is equal to the last index plus 1. And this is really important because it tells us that I can figure out what my last index is from the length, and I can also figure out my length from the last index. Remember, you count your length normally, but since you're counting your index from 0, your index value will be 1 lesser than your length. So in this case, the third element will have a second index. Your fourth element will have a 3 as your index. So therefore, if the number of elements is 5, which is the length of the array, your last index is 5 minus 1, which is just 4. And if you know that your index is 2, that element is the third element because 2 plus 1 is 3. And that's really important, but it's also really simple to know. So over here, you can see that I have 5 elements. Since I have 5 elements, the length of my array is 5, and I can just enter in 5 over here. This is really important. You could miss out and you could make a compile time error. So make sure that you mention the length of your array, because when you mention the length, Java actually creates those number of spaces or contiguous memory locations to store these values. So if you look at my array, I have 5 values. But how do I access a particular value in my array? So let's say I want to access 60. How do I access 60? Normally in a variable, you would know that the variable has a name. It has a particular name, and you would use that name to access the value in that variable. But in this case, I'm storing all of them under one name as age. So how would I access it? Now, even though I didn't give a specific name to each of my values, I did give them index positions, or rather the compiler gave them index numbers. And what I can do is use the index number and the name of my array to access a particular value. So for instance, if I want to access the first value, that is 25, I can use the index number, which is 0. So it will look a little like this. Age at 0 will give me 25. If I want to access the second value, which is 14, I will use the index, which is 1. So age at 1 will give me 14. And this will follow for the others as well. 60 will be age at 2 because 2 is the index number for that particular element. 12 would be age at 3, 3 would be age at 4. So you can see how I can use my name of the array and the index number in brackets, in square brackets, to access the particular element. Now what is really important to notice is that this notation that I showed you of the name of the array and an index number in brackets acts as a variable name. Instead of giving each of these variables or values a particular variable name, I'm giving it the name of the array and index number as a variable name. It's behaving like a variable name. So age at 1 can be used to access 14 or can also be used to change 14. And now we're going to look at the actual program where we're going to access the values using this notation and where we're going to change the values using this notation. Now this brings me to another important point. As you can see, I made my array age over here, but I haven't entered all of these values yet. We will learn how to enter those values, but this brings up another question. If I haven't entered any values, then what does this array currently contain? Would it look like this, as an empty array with no values and just index numbers? Well, that can't exist. You know that whenever you create a variable, if you don't enter a value, the compiler will enter the default value for you. So your variable or your memory location here can't be empty. It has to store something. And just like I mentioned before, it will store something. It will store the default values for the particular data type of the array. So in this case, this array will actually look like this. Since it's an integer array, it will store all zeros, since 0 is the default value for the int data type. If it was something like a double, it will store 0.0 because that is the default value. If it's a boolean, it will store false because, well, that's the default value for booleans. This is really important because this tells you that whenever you create an array, it will always be stored with something. What we're doing is we're not adding values, we're changing values. So if I enter 25 for my age at 0, I'm not putting in or entering 25. Instead, I'm changing the 0 which is already in that memory location to 25. If I put in 3 for my fourth index, I'm not entering 3, I'm changing my 0 to 3. So now that we've understood that, let's actually just enter the values for my age array over here. And I want to enter the same values as these. So for my first position, which is the value at index 0, I want to enter 3. I told you this works the same way as variables. So if you have, for example, if you have a variable like int a is 0, to change it to 3, we just say a equals 3. In the same way, currently my value at position or index 0 is 0 because that's the default value. To change it, I will just say age at 0 equals 3. And this line of code is just going to change that 0 to a 3. Let me just do these for the other values as well. So now that I've added all these values for my array, what if I want to change a certain value to something else? So let's say I want to change 14 over here to something like 26. And I don't want to change it over here. This code is fixed. I want to change it somewhere else. I told you this works the same way as a variable. So if I set a variable a to 14, I could change it to 26 by just saying a equals 26. So this works in the exact same way. If I want to change this to 26, I can just say age at 2 is 26. And this works perfectly fine. Now to show that this actually worked, I added a println statement before the change and after the change. So before the change, the value was still 14, so it should print 14. But after I changed it, it should print 26. So when I run the code, it gives me 14 and then it gives me 26. So it works perfectly well. You also learned something else. You can print the values in the same way you would print a variable. Age at 2, I told you, is behaving like a variable. So when you add it over here, it's just going to print that value at that index 2. Now there is another way to initialize these values, which is a lot easier than this whole bunch of code. Here you can see that I'm setting each value individually. But there is one way to set all of these values directly in the first line of code. Now all of this, it doesn't change. This is still the way you can access a particular value at a particular index position. But the only thing we're gonna learn about is just a different method to set these values for all of these index positions. So as you can see, I commented this piece of code, and now I just want to initialize my values from this first line where I declared my array as age. Now, the way you would do this is by using what is known as an initialiser list. So what you do is just remove this and add curly brackets. And the next thing is you're just going to enter the values in the correct order in the curly brackets. So in this case, the first value is 3, after that it's 25, after that it's 14, 14 again, and then 60. So I entered all the values in the correct order, and you notice that I can directly enter the values for my array age instead of adding each value in each line. Now I can test this out with a println statement. I wrote system.println age at 0, and this should give me 3. When I run this code, I do get 3. So it works really well. So that's it. That's the basics of using arrays in Java. Now there is still a lot more, and in the next few videos we'll learn about using these arrays, iterating through these arrays, and modifying the values. As always, thank you for watching.